Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be sitting down with Chip Conley. He's the former head of strategy for Airbnb, a seasoned CEO, veteran TED speaker, and New York Times bestselling author, and now head of the Modern Elder Academy. What I love about Chip is that he's the rare leader who has not just walked the walk when it comes to building a successful business 3 times over, but that he's thoughtful enough to have collected wisdom along the way in a way that can be easily distilled and shared. I want to ask him how we can find meaning in the age of AI. As more leaders turn to AI to guide them, are humans becoming obsolete or more important than ever? Let's find out. Chip, really happy to have you on the show here today. I'm really excited. It's funny when I was interested in having you on the show, the Chip I knew was sort of the head of strategy for Airbnb, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. But as I've learned more about you and followed you over the last few years, that's sort of one stop on the broader journey that is Chip, and one component of the Chip Conley doctrine. Maybe before we dive into things too much, can you tell me a little bit about and I'm trying not to be too facetious with Chip Conley doctrine, but what your overall message is these days. What's the problem you're seeing out there in this age, and what you're trying to get across to people.
Well, I would say that, and we'll get into my history and how I got there, but I think in the era we live in, human wisdom has more value than ever before. But a lot of people see wisdom as something abstract that only Yoda or Dumbledore has access to, and they don't realize the practical application of wisdom and how in the era of AI and rampant, commoditization of knowledge, wisdom becomes more and more scarce and valuable resource in a complicated world.
Let's um let's unpack that a little bit, because there's some very deliberate word choices in there. Wisdom and knowledge, which you said is being commoditized. Um, and one of the things that we hear about AI is that it's intelligent. Obviously, the I stands for intelligence, but it's unmetered intelligence, and now everybody has access to unlimited intelligence. And, there's this idea and this trend now where, why would I bother asking another human when I could just ask AI and it'll give me an answer at my fingertips? And so you very deliberately distinguished knowledge from wisdom. What do you make of that? And what is the right case for using AI to learn more about your context or, your job or your life, versus what value do people still bring?
AI is able to summarize all of the knowledge of the world and all of the points of view of the world in such a expeditious and expert way that there's a perspective that, why would I need anything more than the wisdom of a crowd? And so, in some ways, AI is taking the wisdom of crowds and making it more practical. I think the challenge with that is there are sometimes when you want the crowd sourced knowledge that AI can bring you, but sometimes there's the uniqueness of a particular point of view that is exactly what you need to hear at this particular moment. And as Pablo Picasso said long ago, computers are useless. They only give you answers. And I think that my experience with AI has been AI is remarkable at giving me answers, not nearly as good at asking the right questions that I need to hear at this particular moment. I think it's getting better at that. And the more it gets to know me, the better it gets at asking the right questions. But at the end of the day, knowledge, as they say, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. And so for me, there's times when the context of what I am looking for requires human intuition, someone being able to see my facial expressions and how I'm reacting to something. Um, Someone who could actually give me some imagination and something maybe outlandish in terms of a point of view that I might not get from AI. Um, the other thing is that, AI has not suffered as far as I know. Um, and so it's the storytelling sometimes of that wise person, and the wise person doesn't necessarily have to be older than you. The wise person could be younger than you. But it's that storytelling and it's the experience of hearing of someone else's experience that allows you to realize that wisdom is not taught, it's shared. And, so I don't think AI could teach wisdom. I think another human being can share it and actually allow someone else to get wiser.
There's there's a lot of really interesting stuff wrapped up in there, and I'll come back to the Picasso quote, which I love, by the way, about just giving you answers, because that feels like almost like a leadership trap of just give me the answer. I'm just looking for the answer, right?
Sure.
Versus, to your point, understanding the context or understanding the right question. And I don't mean to get too philosophical here, but there's, I think a really interesting and important distinction around, what is the role of the leader and what role can AI play in that. And so, maybe I'll ask this somewhat abstract question, but is AI a useful leadership tool at all? And what role does it play, you know, in the broader toolkit of a modern business leader?
Well, first of all, I think, learning how to ask great questions is a really important role for a leader. I'm a big fan of appreciative inquiry, which is a form of generative questions you can ask someone else. But also being able to ask the right questions of AI, is a skill. Just because two people have AI or let's say chat, doesn't mean that one person they're both going to get the same knowledge because so much of it comes down to the precision of the kind of questions you ask. So I do think that leadership in the era of AI is a combination of helping people understand how to access the greatest treasure within AI. So we're doing that at the Modern Elder Academy MEA right now with our team, is really teaching everybody how do you use the AI in a way that's going to maximize its effectiveness for you. But then how do you actually realize when AI is not going to solve something? And for example, marketing copy. AI can do really passable marketing copy to market something, but it misses the sort of soulful fingerprint that has just the ingenuity baked into it based upon a conversation our marketing person had with two of our alumni this morning that just sort of like captured that conversation is not captured on AI. That conversation where two women were talking about why they loved MEA, that was based upon a personal experience that someone on our marketing team had with those two women, and that data point of what those women said does not exist in the world of AI because it doesn't exist on a computer. It doesn't there's no data point for it because happened in a verbal conversation that was not captured by AI or any technology. It was a conversation in the field, and that conversation could lead to, the synapses firing and then a new ingenuity and a new line. And so if you want efficiency, AI is gonna be amazing and for you. If you want soulfulness, you need to mix as a leader the voice of the soul and fingerprints of people that are not captured in the context of the crowdsourcing opportunity that AI offers. So I think it's the individuality and maybe the quirkiness that can happen. Now, it doesn't mean that AI can't write you a quirky blog post, and I do that. I have a daily blog, and I gotta tell you, ever since AI came along, my daily blog has become a lot easier to write. Um, Partly because, it's like daily blog of 500 words on average, 600 words, like, okay, that's an accomplishment to do that every day, and so there's times when I'll just say, like, here are my inputs. Here's 2 articles that I have read that I like. Here's my point of view on it. Give me 500 words, and then I see it, and I was like, there might be 10% of it that I would change, and the 10% I'd change and it's doing it in my voice, let's be clear, the 10% I'd change is often the kind of thing that AI doesn't know. It's a new perspective I have that actually that I have based upon a dream I had last night, or literally talking about the dream I had last night and how that relates to this. So, but that's a beautiful opportunity to say, like, this is where a marriage of human and AI can be very powerful. The problem is in the process of efficiency and bowing to the gods of efficiency, many people who would not do what I just said. They would just say like, "Ah, here's the inputs. Give me the blog post," and then the blog post comes out, a minute, 20 seconds later. It's like, "Okay, perfect. Let's throw that up." And that's when I think you get to this sort of the lowest common denominator as opposed to the highest common denominator. And the highest common denominator is when you actually give those fingerprints of the soulfulness to, in addition to the sort of the core of that blog post, to use the blog post example.
If you work in IT, Infotech Research Group is a name you need to know. No matter what your needs are, Infotech has you covered. AI strategy? Covered. Disaster recovery? Covered. Vendor negotiation? Covered. Infotech supports you with the best practice research and a team of analysts standing by, ready to help you tackle your toughest challenges. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. That word soulfulness has come up a handful of times, Chip, and you've probably used it more than every other guest I've had on this show combined. It's not a word we talk about a lot here, but I want to talk about soulfulness for a minute because it's a very deliberate word choice, and is obviously very evocative. Maybe to provide some context to it, though, let's back up for a second and talk about, in your view, what is the role of a leader? Where can a leader add the most value? What should they be doing? And where does this notion of soulfulness come into the mix?
So, a leader's job, one of my favorite questions to ask my direct reports at the three companies that I have helped to run, which would have been Joie de Vivre, which is a boutique hotel company that I started when I was 26 and ran for 24 years. I became the second largest in the US with 52 boutique hotels around California. And then 7.5 years as the modern elder to the Airbnb founders, as the head of global hospitality and strategy, but the mentor to the founders as well. And then as the founder and executive chair of the Modern Elder Academy. The question I love to ask is the following: how can I support you to do the best work of your life here at, let's say, Airbnb? And the reason I love that question is because I think a leader's role is to both support in that servant leadership kind of way. Servant leadership means basically the more senior you are in an organization, the more you're there to serve the people who are less senior, lower on the org chart. So service is part of what a leader does. And how can I support you is a great way to start the question, because it's coming from the premise that as a leader, my job is to help you be successful. But the second part of that question is to do the best work of your life. How can I support you to do the best work of your life? I want you to stretch. I want to create the conditions for you to look back at this stage of your life and say, I learned more, I did more, I accomplished more, and I feel incredibly complete about that era of my life. And it wasn't just me, I was doing it with a group of people. And we did that. We did that together. So, that how can I support you to do the best work of your life, at Airbnb? The broader premise behind this question, though, is the really important thing, which is it is suggesting that it is not my job as the leader to prop you up so you're successful. Your job is to have agency and to tell me with accountability what it is you need to do the best work of your life. You don't spring this question on someone and then expect them to answer immediately. You say, let's get together a week from now. And I'd love to have you come to the meeting with some thoughts about what do you need. And so I use this question to make the abstract of leadership practical, because practically speaking, a leader's job is to help the people who work with them to do the best work of their life and to support them to do that and to help them feel supported. But it all is also, um, the leader's job to get people to stretch a little, not just to do the best work of their life, but stretch from the point of view of getting clear on what resources they need to be successful. And while the conversation that can happen out of this question can be awkward at times because a week later, your direct report comes in and says, "Here's the 22 things I need." And you as the boss know that, 18 of those 22 things you cannot offer them, at least not yet. And there's only 4 that you can do. But that conversation's a valuable one because what it does is it, first of all, gets your direct report to think like a leader. Because a great leader is a resource allocator. A great leader is, makes, dozens of decisions every day about resource allocation. And so the resource allocation, putting that in the lap of your direct report puts them in a position where they have agency and they have the ability to say like, I actually, these are the things I need, I think, and now I need to hear talk to my boss who asked me this question to see what they think. Um, but it's been a provocative question that I have found to lead to really interesting conversations because I think at the end of the day, a great leader is somebody who is both a librarian and a confidant. So the librarian means that you have the know-how and know-who to help a direct report in ways that allow them to ask you questions and you answer the questions. But that's the librarian role. The confidant role is a confidant doesn't just have your secrets. A confidant is the one who gives you confidence. And in a confidant role, your role is as the leader is to ask great questions. And by asking great questions, helping guide somebody to find their roadmap to success. And it is those 2 roles as a leader, occasionally the librarian with the answers and occasionally the confidant with the questions, that actually allows a direct report to feel like, wow, this person has my back. This person in the habitat that this leader has created, um, I'm supported, but I'm also stretching, and I'm starting to think like a leader myself. So a great leader incubates great leaders.
I want to press on that a little bit more, Chip, in the context of, again, of soulfulness, because there's everything you said makes complete sense. But to me, there's a soulless potential reading
Yeah.
of that definition where you can be a leader, you can be a resource allocator, you can try and do your best work, but where you view your own role as almost like a human automaton, where you're like you're a stand-in for just, "Oh, I'm an operational execution-based leader and I just, plug things in from A to B." And it's soulless, it's almost robotic. But that's not really what you're saying, I don't think. You're saying that there's a soulfulness that a leader can bring to what they do that's, if I'm understanding you correctly, that's irreplaceable by AI. What does that look like, and what does that add to the mix and to the organization?
Well, there's an empathy, so let's like go to the question of like what is a soul? So as a soul is, in my point of view, and again, I have a unique point of view here. I believe the soul incarnates in us as we're born, and our job is to be the steward of the soul over the course of a lifetime. We die, the physical body dies, that soul lives on and is going to be incarnated in somebody else. And part of our role in this lifetime is to evolve the soul and the consciousness of that soul and become wiser as a result. So that's the background. Having said that, when you meet somebody who is soulful, what you notice about them is often human qualities that are are what Dacher Keltner, the UC Berkeley professor who started the Greater Good Science Center, calls moral beauty. Moral beauty is the number one pathway for a person to feel awe in life. It's not nature. It's actually being exposed to someone with moral beauty. It's someone who is got grit and tenacity, got courage, got compassion, got equanimity, um, kindness. So someone who's soulful feels very human in the best sense of the word. But somebody who's soulful is also connected to something beyond themselves. A soul feels connected to other souls and to everything in life. So when you meet a leader that's soulful, you what you can feel is the heartbeat of that leader, but you can also feel the heart that this leader is connected to something much greater than themselves. And whether that is God, whether that's source or some belief around something spiritual, or whether it's just the ability for a soulful leader to be able to be intuitive. And, intuition is not something, someone who's soulless doesn't feel very intuitive. Someone who's soulful feels like they're connected to something almost indescribable that allows them to make better decisions and be able to be more intuitive about me because my soulful leader sort of understands me and how I tick. Um, so, to me, someone who's soulful is the best expression of human qualities, that moral beauty, while being connected to something bigger than themselves. And, you meet somebody like that and you sort of want to lean in and spend more time with them. So they're not robotic. They're not purely focused on efficiency. Um, yeah.
There's, um there's a prevailing sentiment right now, I would say, a somewhat cynical one, but I find myself thinking about it too, that soulfulness is in decline these days. That with AI, with, you know, technology in general, social media, the just kind of rampant consumerism and, people's attention spans and just how we're choosing to live our lives these days, that we're risking eroding soulfulness at a societal level. Do
But
you believe that's Go ahead.
what I would say, I'm sorry to interrupt, Jeff. When something is scarce, it becomes more valuable. So if what you're saying is true, and I'm going to answer whether I think it's true in a moment, but if what you're saying is true, for those of us who want to try to be more soulful, it may actually have more value. Just like in a world in which it feels like knowledge is rampant, and wisdom is scarce, it's possible that wisdom becomes more valuable based upon the law of economics, potentially. Now, again, if something is scarce and it's scarce because it's not valuable, that's a whole different thing. But whether it's soulfulness or wisdom, I do believe that there's deep value, and I think people see it. And Justice Pot Justice Potter on the Supreme Court in the United States long ago, talking about pornography, like, "How do you define pornography?" And he said, "Well, you know it when you see it." And I think that's true about soulfulness and wisdom too. You know it when you feel it, when you see it, when you're exposed to it. And, so in my opinion, I think what is there's a lot of things happening right now, and, as a Canadian, you know better than I do, what impact that's having in the world in terms of a political world that is, full of expediency, a political world that is, in many ways, is survival of the fittest. And there's a bit of a rugged individualism and, like America first, Canada first, whatever first. Like, everybody's gotta be first, but not everybody can be first. And in that so I think what that's created, and especially because of our president of the United States, without going down the rabbit hole of politics, there's a coarseness. There's a coarseness, and I think that coarseness, um, one truism about leadership is the more senior you are in an organization, the more emotionally contagious you are, and the more character contagious you are. So you are a role model, and as a role model, what comes from that is you have a huge influence on how people are showing up in the world or in an organization. So I think it's not surprising given, the nature of some of the leaders we have in the world, and I'm, by the way, a huge fan of Mark Carney, so I would just say, like, I really appreciate his leadership right now. Um, I think that coarseness would be perceived as the opposite of soulfulness, and expediency and selfish individualism is the opposite of communitarianism and the idea of how are we in this together. So I would agree with you on some level that I think there's a pervasive top down leadership slash character and emotional uh, perspective that is infecting the world. Having said that, I think what it does is it makes it the people who are showing up and saying things or exhibiting behavior that is soulful or humanistic that much more loved and cherished. So the pendulum is always swinging. We are at one era of the pendulum swing, and I think we were going to see a pendulum swing back in the next few years, in my opinion, that will lead to um, more of a prizing of people who have a humanistic, soulful perspective, a long-term perspective. Um, but I think, it's easy to say right now that we're in an era in which that has is not in power.
Let's talk about that piece for a minute because you touched on something there, in our little political detour, about values in leadership right now, and it does feel politically and frankly, I think, in the corporate world as well, that there's this sense of this, sort of win at all costs leadership that, let's just do everything in our power to, get ahead, to make as much money as possible, to, you know, the word, arms race or,
AI race.
the yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the metaphor of war and winners and losers seems to be extremely popular right now, and the corollary to that is there's,
Say
almost a
that word
view
again?
corollary.
Wait, is that how Canadians pronounce corollary?
Corollary? I don't know.
I don't know. I just loved it. I loved it. Okay, go back to you.
We'll have to check that in post. What I was gonna say though is that, um, there's an implication, let's say, to keep things simpler, that soulfulness or this, more human quality is in some ways weakness. That in this world where, might makes right and we have to get ahead at all costs, to be soulful is to be weak, and it is to yield, conditions of victory, let's say, to people who are going to be more brash and more abrasive. Now, I I don't wanna ask you a loaded question, but it's difficult for me to believe that you agree with that, and so I'm curious what your response is to that line of reasoning and values.
Well, I'll use a war analogy, which is you can win the battle but lose the war, and I actually think that's what's gonna happen. That's what's happening, and I think, otherwise, we are in for a lot of trouble because, a dog eat dog world, at some point means we're eating dogs, and we're eating each other, and we're creating, with the weapons of mass destruction that we have at our fingertips and with, you know, AI, relate with drones and some of the kinds of warfare and biological warfare and things that could happen without ethics. I mean, this is what's interesting to me right now is yes, the battle right now seems to be lost to those in the short term who are, you know, sort of trying to use rugged individualism as a means of getting what they want. Having said that, one of the things that's really interesting in talking to humanities professors and university people is in the last 2 years, a real growth in curiosity in philosophy majors and ethics majors. And in some ways, some of these kinds of forms of education that have really been, neglected. Uh, and what we are seeing is that there's a discernment that people are looking for, and they're looking to ask bigger and deeper questions. And, talking to some people I know in the AI world, they love philosophers. There's a recent interesting article about the ethicist who is at Anthropic, I think it was. And she's, I think it was New York Times maybe. And she's young. She's 37 years old. Um, but the idea that you need an ethicist for some of the questions that we are exposing ourselves to these days, is to me the bamboo shoots that I'm curious about. The bamboo shoots are saying like, yeah, if we are starting to maybe f- till the ground to make fertile soil for bigger ethical, philosophical, humanistic questions, I think that's encouraging. But I think we're like in to use baseball as an analogy, and I know you have your Toronto Blue Jays. You're in Toronto. So
I'm in
you're
Toronto, that's right.
so yes, you got your Blue Jays and we're in the first inning of the baseball game of a 9-inning game. And when it comes to some of these questions, the thing that's interesting is I think that this back to my original premise, this is part of the reason I think wisdom is making a comeback. Wisdom was very popular 2,000 years ago, and the last 500 years in particular, the era of enlightenment, and then not the knowledge, the idea of knowledge creation, and the idea of ivory towers of knowledge and accumulating knowledge. I think the interest in the kinds of questions that help us to discern how to live a good life, um, and how to create a society that can have a good life. These are the kinds of questions that I think are going to become more available to us, or and available to us is not the right way. Say it. I think more. There'll be more curiosity around it, and you could say in some ways that there's a lot of literature and a lot of essays written 50, 100 years ago about the leisure class and what we have coming forward. The idea that in an era in which machines and are going to give us more time and space in our life, there will be more space for leisure and asking bigger questions. Well, that has not really happened. Let's be clear. Like the number of hours we're working compared to 50 years ago is more. We're working more hours. We have more of a disparity between rich and poor. We have a lot of things that are suggesting like there was this leisure class thing didn't happen. Um, but I think with AI, I really think we may finally be there where the efficiency of AI will allow us to then have the opposite kind of questions, which are, curiosity is not efficient. Curiosity opens up a can of worms. And I think the kinds of questions we'll ask, with more leisure and space in our life will be the kinds of questions that a philosopher or an ethicist or a humanities major would ask. And therefore, they're going to be in more demand. So we'll see. I mean, I'm this is my conjecture about this because I think the opposite of that, which is we just get more and more efficient and more selfish, is to me on the road to destruction.
No, I'm inclined to agree with that, and certainly when we think about the future of work, it's not hard to imagine a path, and some studies have actually come out recently that support it. That as you gain the ability to be more efficient, rather than doing less work, you just end up doing more work, right? Like your individual output just gets higher and higher, and it's almost, a race to the bottom. And so I'm curious, as we look out at these potentially diverging paths and this, foundation of new technology here, in your view, I'll ask sort of the big view, the big question, Chip, which is, what is the future of work to you? And maybe, on the opposite end, what is it not? Where can we go from here? And where would you like to see us not go?
Well, I think the future of work. So Khalil Gibran in the book The Prophet that he wrote said work is love made visible. But tell that to a factory worker on an assembly line. And I think that the way we have looked at work in the 20th century was sort of it was toil. In the 19th century, it was farming, and in some ways, you controlled your destiny to some degree. A farmer's an entrepreneur, and you choose what you're gonna plant. But we moved into the 20th century with the assembly line culture and with the manufacturing, and I will say that I think the reason that retirement as a concept became more and more appealing was because work became less and less appealing. And, um, as we moved into the latter part of the 20th century and knowledge work, a term that Peter Drucker coined in 1959, became more predominant. I think we went back to the Khalil Gibran work is love made visible point of view, which is people really enjoying the work more and realizing that you could be doing this kind of work later in life. I mean, the problem with being a factory worker or, carrying boxes for a living is your body's worn out by the time you get to your 50s. And yet, when we know that, when it comes to intelligence, you have fluid intelligence, which is fast and focused, and you have crystallized intelligence, which gets better as you get older, which is thinking synthetically, holistically, and connecting the dots. So there are knowledge workers who in their 50s, 60s, and 70s may be actually coming into their own in certain kinds of thinking, this crystallized kind of thinking. And so therefore, I think that the future of work, um, is not as bad as it's been in the 1950, meaning it's like people doing work that they love and doing work that they can do later in their life. Um, if you read Arthur Brooks, who's on our faculty at MEA, he's also faculty at Harvard. If you read his book From Strength to Strength, he talks in the book, he talks about the Modern Elder Academy in the book, but he talks in the book about the idea of what kind of professions are most suitable for people as they get older. And often they're teaching and philosophizing and they're crystallized intelligence. The idea of being able to use both sides of your brain, which is actually what you get better at as you get older, is you're not so fixated to left versus right. You're the you're the integration of the two. Um, so I think the future of work will be synthesizing these bigger, deeper questions, using AI as an amazing partner, um, with the efficiency. Again, in some ways, the assembly line created an efficiency. Unfortunately, the worker on the assembly line was a cog in the wheel. Will knowledge workers and those of us who want to use our brains be a cog in the wheel of what AI can do? Right now, I don't think so. In the future, I don't know. But right now, I think we are partners with AI, and AI can do things just like an assembly line can do that is they can do it better than we can do it ourselves, and certainly faster. Um, but I think the future of work, is gonna potentially there's all kinds of professions, leadership coaches, management coaches, life coaches. 50 years ago, they're you went to a therapist for that kind of stuff. But you didn't go to a therapist because it was too expensive and it was like, it didn't look good to, your friends or your spouse. So, there's like professions that are gonna, they're gonna be lifestyle curators. They're gonna be people who are gonna help you to curate a life. They're gonna be the Modern Elder Academy, MEA, a place that is dedicated to helping people to distill the wisdom they've learned along the way and figure out what's next in their life as a result of that. Um, I just think there's gonna be a whole collection of new kinds of businesses and professions in the future of work that double down on that soulful humanity piece, um, and really help people to make sense of their life experience such that it becomes wisdom. I define wisdom as metabolized experience mindfully shared for the common good. And there's, so I think helping people to realize how do you metabolize experience? How do you tap into the collective consciousness? Because there are 10-year-olds who are wise, not because they have a lot of life experience or good at distilling their life experience, but because they can tap into something intuitively deeper than just their own experience. But mindfully shared is also a really important piece of that. How do you help people use their wisdom? uh, Part of the reason I did well at Airbnb was because I had over 100 mentees over 7.5 years. And my job was not to like sit them down at my feet and say, well, I'm a boomer and you're a millennial. Let me tell you how the world works. Because I would have gotten an okay boomer in my face if I'd done that. So this idea of mindfully sharing it and how do we help people to get better at collaborating, which is a skill that I think is going to grow in an era of AI. Um, yeah. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm getting pretty abstract here, but I deeply believe that the future of work is going to be a future based upon the humanities and psychology and philosophy and a bunch of disciplines within the academy that have generally been not as well regarded until just recently.
And I think it's a great, I love sort of the abstract of it. I think it's a great kind of philosophical framing. Let's, maybe shift gears a little bit and try and bring it to like the hyper practical by talking about, individual, what can happen for the individual. And, one of the themes that's in the background there that I want to, bring into the foreground is this sort of crisis of meaning that's happening. And you think about it a little bit more through the lens of, middle age and that transition for, folks as they, move into their 40s and 50s. And so Chip, for folks who are, they're at that career stage now, at that life stage, they're being subject to some of these technological changes that maybe impact their sense of meaning. What advice would you give them, if they're in a job where they're saying, "Okay, you know, I'm concerned that, I'm not maybe having the impact that I thought I would have, or I have been doing more toil than labors of love in my career." When you're in that zone, how much, in your perspective, how much latitude do you have to change that at that point? Because I know that's also a concern for people if, "Oh, I've got less road ahead of me than behind me at this age. What can I do, and how can I regain that feeling of meaning?"
So Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is one of my favorite books. And I call it a leadership book, which, most people wouldn't say that. It's the story of an Austrian Jewish psychologist who ends up in a concentration camp in World War II. And if I could distill the wisdom of maybe most famous book ever written on meaning down to an equation, and I ultimately wrote a book called Emotional Equations that was a New York Times bestseller that came out in 2012. The equation for man's search for meaning is despair equals suffering minus meaning. And what does that mean? So despair and meaning are inversely proportional. Suffering is sort of a constant in life. It's a Buddhism point of view, which is, the Buddhists say the first noble truth of Buddhism is that suffering is ever present. And so there's a sense that, we're always attached to something, and that attachment in our life can create suffering. So what does that mean then? Despair equals suffering minus meaning. It means that if you can increase your meaning, you'll reduce your despair. And what Frankl saw in a concentration camp was he saw that the people who actually lived were not necessarily the ones who were the most physically in good shape. They were, frankly, the ones who actually had hope and meaning, who could see on the other side of this awful experience of being in a concentration camp that they were going to be a better grandmother, or they were going to actually write a screenplay, or they were going to find the love of their life, or they're going to be a better parent. Um, so in Frankl's case, it was he knew he wanted to write a book, Man's Search for Meaning. Um, so woven into the idea of meaning is this sense of agency, a word I used earlier, and the sense that there's something you're supposed to do with it. One of my favorite phrases is the purpose of your life is to discover your gift. I change that and say the purpose of life is to discover your wisdom. The work of life is to develop it. And the meaning of life is to give your gift or your wisdom away. So meaning often purpose can have very singular, it can be personal, but meaning to me has a communal, a social element to it. And so one of the things a person could do, and one of the things I've done since I was age 28, is to try to make sense of the wisdom I've learned along the way. So a practice I've done to make this practical is since age 28, every weekend, so for the last 37 years, I have sat down and for 20 to 30 minutes on a weekend, I've said, what were my biggest lessons of the week? What did I learn? And often it was a painful lesson. And how will it serve me in the future? How will that lesson serve me so that I'm a better person or a wiser person as a result of that? So this is the metabolizing experience piece. Well, what I do with my leadership teams, and again, that's something someone could do, but like now let's make it even more practical. Let's talk about how a leadership team could do this. I don't require my leadership teams to do their, weekly wisdom journal. But what I do require is once a quarter, our leadership team at all three companies I've led, uh, we sit down and we say, have each person say what was their biggest lesson of the quarter. So what did you learn? Like what happened? Like what was the thing that happened? What'd you learn from it? How will it serve you in the future? Now, the reason I love this is because it is a growth mindset. So you can have a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So fixed mindset means that you're sort of trying to prove yourself and your job is to optimize what you have. In a growth mindset, you're trying to improve yourself and you're not trying to succeed necessarily, you're trying to learn. And Satya Nadella, to his credit, and he's I think a great CEO at Microsoft. He realized that when he joined Microsoft as the CEO, he realized in 2014 that this was a know-it-all culture, and he wanted it to be a learn-it-all culture. And so he instituted millions of dollars of growth mindset training that helped people to say, "How are we learning? How are we in constant motion for learning here?" And, to his credit, I mean, Microsoft has been one of the biggest winners on the stock market in the last dozen years, and especially in AI. So what I would just say is this exercise where a leadership team comes together once a quarter is vulnerable and candid enough, but also curious and learning enough to actually say, each person on a six-person team, let's say, says, here's what I learned. Here's how it's going to serve me. And then the team at the end says, okay, what was our biggest team lesson of the quarter? And we arm wrestle over that. But the beauty of this is that I might learn some wisdom from the CFO who was talking about something he learned or she learned. And so to me, that is a meaningful exercise. It creates a wiser organization. It allows you to share your wisdom that you've learned along the way, the hard way, because our painful life lessons are often the raw material for our future wisdom. And most importantly, it's creating an environment where people are constantly realizing that the work that they're doing is a noble experiment. It's not about failures. It's about learning from the experiments that you're doing, and that creates meaning. So meaning can come from a combination of realizing that you're getting better at something, or something is improving, or there is hope and belief on the other side of this that you will be wiser as a result of it. I there was a woman who came to a Modern Elder Academy workshop recently, and she was distraught. She'd both gotten fired from her job. She's a knowledge worker, gotten fired from her job partly because of AI, in her belief at least, and her husband had filed for divorce like within the same month. And so when it came to the divorce piece, um, I asked her, I said, like, "Okay, I know how hard it feels," and they had 2 kids, the kids are not living at home anymore, so for the first time in 30 years, she's living alone, and she's struggling. But I said to her, "At some point, are you gonna maybe start dating again?" And she said, "Yeah, I think I will." And then I asked her the question that really helped. I asked her, "Do you think you're gonna wear a better pair of glasses to understand your next mate? Do you have life experience that has made you wiser based upon this marriage you were in?" And she said, "Absolutely. I know, especially the filters of what I'm gonna look for. I'm not gonna get marry a narcissist again. I'm not gonna do this, I'm not gonna do that." Like, and she just sort of said, and she realized as she was spouting all of this, she had learned something. There was some wisdom in that painful experience. And there's some meaning that can come from that. It means that she's gonna be a lot more thoughtful and discerning about who her next mate may be. So meaning comes from the sense that we're learning something along the way and that we can share it with others. And I mean, this is again part of the reason why MEA, I think, is a, the start of a movement of midlife wisdom schools where people in the middle of their life, at the low point of the U curve of happiness, which is often around 45 to 50, people are asking bigger, deeper questions that allow them to curate the second half of their life differently than the first half.
I want to try to synthesize some of that and, keep me honest here if I'm hitting it or missing it. But there seems to be a theme there around how can we make sure that we're actually looking forward to the future, and how can we sort of package our experience in a way that allows us to do that and also feel a sense of, again, in your word, Chip, agency over our future. Does that resonate with you
Yeah.
in terms of some of the themes there around meaning?
Yeah. No. to Again, despair equals suffering minus meaning. Despair often comes from not having agency. Despair comes from not having hope. Despair comes from, feeling like the suffering will never end. So yeah, their agency is critical. The sense of learning is critical, and wisdom. Um, the sense that there's some hope is critical as well. So yes, I think all of those can help someone find a sense of meaning. But I think the other piece that may be missing in what you said is the ability to share, the ability to actually offer something, um, and to feel that sense of making a difference out there. Um, I do think that that is woven into the best that humans have to offer. Um, so it's not just the selfishness of like, I got what I needed, and now I'm going to take care of my family, which is fine. I mean, you can be very selfish and then do all kinds of good things for your family, and that's good too. But when there's an element of there's a sort of generosity around meaning to me. There's a generosity of spirit that to my mind is woven into what meaning is about, and that's when you feel this deep sense of a new kind of ROI, not the return on investment, but the ripple of impact. And it is in that feeling the ripple of impact, you feel what George Bailey felt in It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart playing George Bailey, he could, based upon what Clarence the Angel did in coming down in that famous movie, coming down and showing George what his little town, Bedford Falls, would have looked like if George had never lived. And he was able to see that the ripple of impact he had was profound. And people want that and need that. And it's part of the reason why children in our lives, our kids, both create short term unhappiness and long term meaning because there's a deep sense that you have maybe, hopefully, had some impact.
It feels to me like one of the biggest barriers to getting there right now is, this pervasiveness in many of our lives of, what I'll call a diet of despair, where we're just being fed all this, rage bait content or, the news and the political cycle and social media is just feeding us all this information designed to, coax us into a state of outrage or feeling despair or feeling that the world is worse than ever. What gives you hope for the future? Like, what do you see as some of the opportunities or, the hopeful signs that things are actually getting better rather than worse?
Well, my experience is very much a function of the 3,000 people who go through our program every year, um, and seeing the transformation of someone who came. I always tell the story of the litigator. She came at age 60 and she'd been a litigator for 35 years and she hated it, but she did it because her father wanted her to become an attorney. And at 60, she came to MEA thinking, I want to work 10 more years, but I don't want to be a litigator anymore. Maybe I'll just be a litigation consultant. And her, she had not opened the aperture of her life and she was very narrow in her thinking. In so doing, she had some despair about like, okay, being a litigation consultant has some upside. I don't have to be in court. I'm the consultant behind the scenes, and maybe that's less stressful. But the reality is, over the course of a week, what I saw from her was she was having dreams and memories of her grandmother. Like, where was that coming from? And cooking pies with her grandmother, and realizing that when she travels overseas, the first thing she does is look for the local bakery because she loves to see what kind of baked goods they have in different parts of the world. In Croatia, it's very different than in Peru. By the end of the week, she realized that she had the hope of, I want to like have a hobby of becoming a pastry chef. And if I really like it, I think I might become a pastry chef entrepreneur, a baker, and create a bakery. And that's what she's done. So that's an N of one, just one person. But with almost 10,000 people who've gone through our program now, I have seen the human spirit and the ability for people to evolve and transform in ways that, our mainstream press and our social media feeds, uh, yes, don't quite capture. Yes, you might not get an Instagram picture of somebody happy on a beach here at MEA with a bunch of new friends. But what that's totally missing is the sense that that woman asked herself, 10 years from now, what will I regret if I don't learn it or do it now? And it was that provocative question, 10 years from now, what will I regret if I don't learn it or do it now? That had her dreaming and having had her, thinking of things that were not adjacent to being a litigator. So I guess where I come from is the small pebble in the pond. How am I we have 56 regional chapters around the world with MEA, and how are those regional chapters making a difference in the communities in which they're located? How do we create a movement of people who feel like their best years are ahead of them, and they're saying that at age 50? And in so doing, I'm doing my part. When it comes to the global perspective, it's interesting that there's more and more trials going on around social media, like legal trials. And the premise of this is very interesting. Is sometimes you don't know the effect of something. You don't know the effect of smoking until lung cancer becomes prevalent, and maybe we're starting to learn some of the effects of some of our technology, and maybe that will lead to some adjustments in laws as well as in behaviors. Um, in many ways, the laws around smoking, there are laws around, you can't smoke in certain places, but generally, people can go smoke in their car. They can do whatever they want. But, the cigarettes have a warning label, and over time, there's a little bit of a social stigma attached to like smoking. You realize that your smoking affects other people. There's secondhand smoke, and frankly, it makes other people smell bad. So, are we sort of in the early stages of maybe a shift in terms of social media and technology that helps people to see that we don't have to, l be the pawns of rage bait? Um, I hope so. I hope so, but I don't know. All I know is what I can do, and that's what I focus on.
So with that in mind, what message would you give to people who are feeling despair right now? And maybe I'll break that into two parts. Business leaders are more uh, people more in the midlife bucket that are feeling despair, and then maybe young people as well. And I know that's where you spend a little bit less of your time, but young people who look at their future and say, "Oh, I can never have the career or the wealth that the baby boomers did." What advice would you give to each of those groups?
Well, for the young people, amazingly, we added someone 2 weeks ago, 24 years old, who came to MEA, and 25% of the people who come to MEA are millennials. So, and obviously a 24-year-old was a Gen Z, but, um, for the young people, I would just say, like, the world is changing faster than ever before. So in some ways, you are at the advantage of that because you can see how to surf the cultural zeitgeist and the technological zeitgeist better than I can. So, there's real opportunity in that. And so I would just say, double down on whatever it is that you're passionate about, whether that's the humanities, because as I've said in this episode, I think humanities will make a comeback, or whether that's understanding how to curate technology in such a way that we make it, a great partner. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think some of the existential issues of climate change, the existential issues of, AI risks. Yes, those things exist, but guess what? Back in the 50s and 60s, we also had nuclear weapons that were really in a dangerous place. We had a Cold War that, and we had, Cuba right off the shore of Florida with Russia having, having missiles there. I mean, like, we've been through some shit before. And so I I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, but I do want to say this is for the young people. You didn't come through AIDS. You didn't come through the Vietnam War era, where Canada got a lot of Americans because they crossed the border because they didn't want to go to the war. So there's been turmoil before. Um, so for others beyond that who are feeling that sense of despair, ask yourself what's one thing you can do today to make a difference out there in somebody else. So the best thing we can do when it comes to despair is to feel like we have some ability to influence something. How do we influence something? How do we help someone else get out of despair? Sometimes the medicine we need is the medicine we're giving. Going out and helping someone else and doing something for someone else can be a great way to feel both a sense that you're giving, but also someone else receives it and you have value to them. The issue as we get older is not about being youthful, it's about being useful. And so it's not about trying to, use the Botox or whatever it is to make you look 10 years younger. Yes, you can do that. That's fine. But at the end of the day, as we get older, the sense of utility and usefulness becomes more and more important. And so when you're feeling despair, looking at how you can be useful is probably the most important thing you can do. Yes, you can do gratitude lists, and there's lots and lots of evidence that, gratitude is a way to solve for despair. But, thinking without acting is not enough. The acting piece is really important.
I love that message. And I think in some ways it's a perfect note to kind of end our conversation on. So, with that, Chip, I wanted to say a big thank you for joining today. It's been a really interesting and really insightful conversation. I know it gave me a sense of inspiration as well. And hopefully, some people listening to it felt that. So, thanks again for joining.
Well, definitely a different conversation than your normal conversation, Jeff. I would guess, and I hope it wasn't too abstract. But I do think the idea of asking bigger and deeper questions is something that is perfectly suited for the time we live in.
I completely agree. And, as someone who has a philosophy background himself in school and a bit of, business ethics as well, I couldn't agree more. I love the comments about asking the right questions and not just, these answer machines. So it certainly resonated with me.
Thank you.
If you work in IT, Infotech Research Group is a name you need to know. No matter what your needs are, Infotech has you covered. AI strategy? Covered. Disaster recovery? Covered. Vendor negotiation? Covered. Infotech supports you with the best practice research and a team of analysts standing by, ready to help you tackle your toughest challenges. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.